Chapter 13 of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Nicholas varies the monotony of Dotheby Hall by a most vigorous and remarkable proceeding, which leads to consequences of some importance. The cold feeble dawn of a January morning was stealing in at the windows of the common sleeping-room when Nicholas, raising himself on his arm, looked among the prostrate forms which on every side surrounded him as though in search of some particular object. It needed a quick eye to detect from among the huddled mass of sleepers the form of any given individual, as they lay closely packed together, covered for warmth's sake with their patched and ragged clothes. Little could be distinguished but the sharp outlines of pale faces, over which the sombre light shed the same dull heavy colour, with here and there a gaunt arm thrust forth, its thinness hidden by no covering, but fully exposed to view in all its shrunken ugliness. There were some who, lying on their backs with upturned faces and clenched hands, just visible in the leaden light, bore more the aspect of dead bodies than of living creatures, and there were others coiled up into strange and fantastic postures, such as might have been taken for the uneasy efforts of pain to gain some temporary relief, rather than the freaks of slumber. A few, and these were among the youngest of the children, slept peacefully on, with smiles upon their faces, dreaming perhaps of home, but ever and again a deep and heavy sigh, breaking the stillness of the room, announced that some new sleeper had awakened to the misery of another day. And as morning took the place of night, the smiles gradually faded away with the friendly darkness which had given them birth. Dreams are the bright creatures of poem and legend, who sport on earth in the night season and melt away in the first beam of the sun, which lights grim care and stern reality on their daily pilgrimage through the world. Nicholas looked upon the sleepers at first with the air of one who gazes upon a scene which, though familiar to him, has lost none of its sorrowful effect in consequence, and afterwards with a more intense and searching scrutiny, as a man would who missed something his eye was accustomed to meet and had expected to rest upon. He was still occupied in this search and had half risen from his bed in the eagerness of his quest when the voice of Squeers was heard calling from the bottom of the stairs. "Now then," cried that gentleman, "are you going to sleep all day up there?" "You lazy hounds!" added Mrs. Squeers, finishing the sentence and producing at the same time a sharp sound like that which is occasioned by the lacing of stays. "We shall be down directly, sir," replied Nicholas. "Down directly?" said Squeers. "Ah! You had better be down directly, or I'll be down upon some of you in less. Where's that Smike?" Nicholas looked hurriedly round again, but made no answer. "Smike!" shouted Squeers. "Do you want your head broke in a fresh place, Smike?" demanded his amiable lady in the same key. Still there was no reply, and still Nicholas stared about him, as did the greater part of the boys, who were by this time roused. "Confound his impudence!" muttered Squeers, rapping the stair-rail impatiently with his cane. "Nickleby!" "Well, sir?" "Send that obstinate scoundrel down. Don't you hear me calling?" "He is not here, sir," replied Nicholas. "Don't tell me a lie," retorted the schoolmaster. "He is." "He is not," retorted Nicholas angrily. "Don't tell me one." "We shall soon see that," said Mr. Squeers, rushing upstairs. "I'll find him, I warrant you." With which assurance Mr. Squeers bounced into the dormitory, and, swinging his cane in the air ready for a blow, darted into the corner where the lean body of the drudge was usually stretched at night. The cane descended harmlessly upon the ground. There was nobody there. "What does this mean?" said Squeers, turning round with a very pale face. "Where have you hid him?" "I have seen nothing of him since last night," replied Nicholas. "Come!" said Squeers, evidently frightened, though he endeavoured to look otherwise. "You won't save him this way. Where is he?" "At the bottom of the nearest pond, for aught I know," rejoined Nicholas in a low voice, and fixing his eyes full on the master's face. "Damn you! What do you mean by that?" retorted Squeers in great perturbation. Without waiting for a reply, he inquired of the boys whether any one among them knew anything of their missing schoolmate. There was a general hum of anxious denial, in the midst of which one shrill voice was heard to say, as indeed everybody thought, "Please, sir, I think Smike's run away, sir." "Ha!" cried Squeers, turning sharply round. "Who said that?" "Tomkins, please, sir," rejoined a chorus of voices. Mr. Squeers made a plunge into the crowd, and at one dive caught a very little boy, habited still in his night-gear, and the perplexed expression of whose countenance as he was brought forward seemed to intimate that he was as yet uncertain whether he was about to be punished or rewarded for the suggestion. He was not long in doubt. "You think he has run away, do you, sir?" demanded Squeers. "Yes, please, sir," replied the little boy. "And what, sir?" said Squeers, catching the little boy suddenly by the arms and whisking up his drapery in a most dexterous manner. "What reason have you to suppose that any boy would want to run away from this establishment? Eh, sir?" The child raised a dismal cry by way of answer, and Mr. Squeers, throwing himself into the most favourable attitude for exercising his strength, beat him until the little urchin in his writhings actually rolled out of his hands, when he mercifully allowed him to roll away as best he could. "There," said Squeers. "Now, if any other boy thinks Smike has run away, I shall be glad to have a talk with him." There was, of course, a profound silence, during which Nicholas showed his disgust as plainly as looks could show it. "Well, Nickleby," said Squeers, eyeing him maliciously, "you think he has run away, I suppose?" "I think it extremely likely," replied Nicholas in a quiet manner. "Oh, you do you?" sneered Squeers. "Maybe you know he has." "I know nothing of the kind." "He didn't tell you he was going, I suppose, did he?" sneered Squeers. "He did not," replied Nicholas. "I am very glad he did not, for it would then have been my duty to have warned you in time." "Which no doubt you would have been devilish sorry to do," said Squeers in a taunting fashion. "I should indeed," replied Nicholas. "You interpret my feelings with great accuracy." Mrs. Squeers had listened to this conversation from the bottom of the stairs, but now, losing all patience, she hastily assumed her night-jacket and made her way to the scene of action. "What's all this here to do?" said the lady, as the boys fell off right and left to save her the trouble of clearing a passage with her brawny arms. "What on earth are you talking to him for, Squeery?" "Why, my dear," said Squeers, "the fact is that Smike is not to be found." "Well, I know that," said the lady, "and where's the wonder? If you get a parcel of proud-stomached teachers that set the young dogs a-rebelling, what else can you look for? Now, young man, you just have the kindness to take yourself off to the schoolroom and take the boys off with you, and don't you stir out of there till you have leave given you, or you and I may fall out in a way that'll spoil your beauty, handsome as you think yourself, and so I tell you." "Indeed?" said Nicholas. "Yes, and indeed again, Mr. Jackanapes," said the excited lady. "I wouldn't keep such as you in the house another hour if I had my way." "Nor would you if I had mine," replied Nicholas. "Now, boys." "Ah, now, boys," said Mrs. Squeers, mimicking as nearly as she could the voice and manner of the usher. "Follow your leader, boys, and take pattern by Smike if you dare. See what he'll get for himself when he's brought back, and mind, I tell you shall have as bad and twice as bad if you so much as open your mouths about him." "If I catch him," said Squeers, "I'll only stop short of flaying him alive. I give you notice, boys." "If you catch him?" retorted Mrs. Squeers contemptuously.
"You are sure to. You can't help it, if you go the right way to work. Come, away with you."
With these words, Mrs. Squeers dismissed the boys, and after a little light skirmishing with those in the rear who were pressing forward to get out of the way, but were detained for a few moments by the throng in front, succeeded in clearing the room when she confronted her spouse alone.
"He is off," said Mrs. Squeers. "The cow-house and stables are locked up, so he can't be there, and he's not downstairs anywhere, for the girl has looked. He must have gone York way, and by a public road too." "Why must he?" inquired Squeers.
"Stupid," said Mrs. Squeers angrily.
"He hadn't any money, had he?"
"Never had a penny of his own in his whole life that I know of," replied Squeers.
"To be sure," rejoined Mrs. Squeers, "and he didn't take anything to eat with him, that I'll answer for."
laughed Squeers.
"Then, of course," said Mrs. S., "he must beg his way, and he couldn't do that nowhere but on the public road."
"That's true," exclaimed Squeers, clapping his hands.
"True, yes, but you'd never have thought of it for all that if I hadn't said so," replied his wife. "Now, if you take the chaise and go one road, and I borrow Swallow's chaise and go the other, what with keeping our eyes open and asking questions, one or other of us is pretty certain to lay hold of him."
The worthy lady's plan was adopted and put in execution without a moment's delay. After a very hasty breakfast and the prosecution of some inquiries in the village, the result of which seemed to show that he was on the right track, Squeers started forth in the pony chaise, intent upon discovery and vengeance. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. Squeers, arrayed in the white top-coat and tied up in various shawls and handkerchiefs, issued forth in another chaise in another direction, taking with her a good-sized bludgeon, several odd pieces of strong cord, and a stout labouring man, all provided and carried upon the expedition with the sole object of assisting in the capture and, once caught, ensuring the safe custody of the unfortunate Smike. Nicholas remained behind in a tumult of feeling, sensible that whatever might be the upshot of the boy's flight, nothing but painful and deplorable consequences were likely to ensue from it. Death from want and exposure to the weather was the best that could be expected from the protracted wandering of so poor and helpless a creature, alone and unfriended, through a country of which he was wholly ignorant. There was little, perhaps, to choose between this fate and a return to the tender mercies of the Yorkshire school. But the unhappy being had established a hold upon his sympathy and a compassion which made his heart ache at the prospect of the suffering he was destined to undergo. He lingered on, in restless anxiety, picturing 1,000 possibilities, until the evening of next day, when Squeers returned alone and unsuccessful.
"No news of the scamp?"
said the schoolmaster, who had evidently been stretching his legs on the old principle not a few times during the journey.
"I'll have consolation for this out of somebody, Nickleby, if Mrs. Squeers don't hunt him down, so I give you warning."
"It is not in my power to console you, sir," said Nicholas. "It is nothing to me."
"Isn't it?" said Squeers in a threatening manner. "We shall see."
"We shall," rejoined Nicholas.
"Here's the pony run right off his legs, and me obliged to come home with a hack cob that'll cost 15 shillings besides other expenses," said Squeers. "Who's to pay for that? Do you hear?"
Nicholas shrugged his shoulders and remained silent.
"I'll have it out of somebody, I tell you," said Squeers, his usual harsh, crafty manner changed to open bullying. "None of your whining vapourings here, Mr. Puppy, but be off to your kennel, for it's past your bedtime. Come, get out."
Nicholas bit his lip and knit his hands involuntarily, for his finger-ends tingled to avenge the insult. But remembering that the man was drunk, and that it could come to little but a noisy brawl, he contented himself with darting a contemptuous look at the tyrant, and walked, as majestically as he could, upstairs. Not a little nettled, however, to observe that Miss Squeers and Master Squeers and the servant girl were enjoying the scene from a snug corner, the two former indulging in many edifying remarks about the presumption of poor upstarts, which occasioned a vast deal of laughter, in which even the most miserable of all miserable servant-girls joined, while Nicholas, stung to the quick, drew over his head such bedclothes as he had, and sternly resolved that the outstanding account between himself and Mr. Squeers should be settled rather more speedily than the latter anticipated. Another day came, and Nicholas was scarcely awake when he heard the wheels of a chaise approaching the house. It stopped. The voice of Mrs. Squeers was heard, and in exultation ordering a glass of spirits for somebody, which was in itself a sufficient sign that something extraordinary had happened. Nicholas hardly dared to look out of the window, but he did so, and the very first object that met his eyes was the wretched Smike, so bedabbled with mud and rain, so haggard and worn and wild that, but for his garments being such as no scarecrow was ever seen to wear, he might have been doubtful even then of his identity.
"Lift him out," said Squeers, after he had literally feasted his eyes in silence upon the culprit. "Bring him in. Bring him in." "Take care," cried Mrs. Squeers as her husband proffered his assistance. "We tied his legs under the apron and made him fast to the chaise to prevent his giving us the slip again."
With hands trembling with delight, Squeers unloosened the cord, and Smike, to all appearance more dead than alive, was brought into the house and securely locked up in a cellar until such time as Mr. Squeers should deem it expedient to operate upon him in presence of the assembled school. Upon a hasty consideration of the circumstances, it may be matter of surprise to some persons that Mr. and Mrs. Squeers should have taken so much trouble to repossess themselves of an encumbrance of which it was their wont to complain so loudly. But their surprise will cease when they are informed that the manifold services of the drudge, if performed by anybody else, would have cost the establishment some 10 or 12 shillings per week in the shape of wages, and furthermore that all runaways were, as a matter of policy, made severe examples of at Dotheby Hall, inasmuch as, in consequence of the limited extent of its attractions, there was but little inducement beyond the powerful impulse of fear for any pupil provided with the usual number of legs and the power of using them to remain. The news that Smike had been caught and brought back in triumph ran like wildfire through the hungry community, and expectation was on tiptoe all the morning. On tiptoe it was destined to remain, however, until afternoon, when Squeers, having refreshed himself with his dinner and further strengthened himself by an extra libation or so, made his appearance, accompanied by his amiable partner, with a countenance of portentous import, and a fearful instrument of flagellation, strong, supple, wax-ended, and new, in short, purchased that morning expressly for the occasion.
"Is every boy here?"
asked Squeers in a tremendous voice. Every boy was there, but every boy was afraid to speak, so Squeers glared along the lines to assure himself, and every eye drooped and every head cowered down as he did so.
"Each boy keep his place?"
said Squeers, administering his favourite blow to the desk, and regarding with gloomy satisfaction the universal start which it never failed to occasion.
"Nickleby, to your desk, sir."
It was remarked by more than one small observer that there was a very curious and unusual expression in the usher's face, but he took his seat without opening his lips in reply. Squeers, casting a triumphant glance at his assistant and a look of most comprehensive despotism on the boys, left the room, and shortly afterwards returned, dragging Smike by the collar, or rather by that fragment of his jacket which was nearest the place where his collar would have been had he boasted such a decoration. In any other place the appearance of the wretched, jaded, spiritless object would have occasioned a murmur of compassion and remonstrance. It had some effect even there, for the lookers-on moved uneasily in their seats, and a few of the boldest ventured to steal looks at each other, expressive of indignation and pity. They were lost on Squeers, however, whose gaze was fastened on the luckless Smike, as he inquired, according to custom in such cases, whether he had anything to say for himself.
"Nothing, I suppose?" said Squeers with a diabolical grin.
Smike glanced round, and his eye rested for an instant on Nicholas, as if he had expected him to intercede, but his look was riveted on his desk.
"Have you anything to say?" demanded Squeers again, giving his right arm 2 or 3 flourishes to try its power and suppleness. "Stand a little out of the way, Mrs. Squeers, my dear. I've hardly got room enough."
"Spare me, sir," cried Smike.
"Oh, that's all, is it?" said Squeers. "Yes, I'll flog you within an inch of your life, and spare you that."
laughed Mrs. Squeers.
"That's a good 'un."
"I was driven to do it," said Smike faintly, and casting another imploring look about him.
"Driven to do it, were you?" said Squeers. "Oh, it wasn't your fault, it was mine, I suppose, eh?" "A nasty, ungrateful, pig-headed, brutish, obstinate, sneaking dog!"
exclaimed Mrs. Squeers, taking Smike's head under her arm and administering a cuff at every epithet.
"What does he mean by that?" "Stand aside, my dear," replied Squeers. "We'll try and find out."
Mrs. Squeers, being out of breath with her exertions, complied. Squeers caught the boy firmly in his grip. One desperate cut had fallen on his body. He was wincing from the lash and uttering a scream of pain. It was raised again, and again about to fall, when Nicholas Nickleby, suddenly starting up, cried, "Stop!" in a voice that made the rafters ring.
"Who cried stop?"
said Squeers, turning savagely round. "I," said Nicholas, stepping forward. "This must not go on."
"Must not go on?"
cried Squeers, almost in a shriek. "No," thundered Nicholas. Aghast and stupefied by the boldness of the interference, Squeers released his hold of Smike, and falling back a pace or 2, gazed upon Nicholas with looks that were positively frightful. "I say must not," repeated Nicholas, nothing daunted. "Shall not. I will prevent it." Squeers continued to gaze upon him, with his eyes starting out of his head, but astonishment had actually for the moment bereft him of speech. "You have disregarded all my quiet interference in the miserable lad's behalf," said Nicholas. "You have returned no answer to the letter in which I begged forgiveness for him and offered to be responsible that he would remain quietly here. Don't blame me for this public interference. You have brought it upon yourself, not I."
"Sit down, beggar!"
screamed Squeers, almost beside himself with rage, and seizing Smike as he spoke.
"Wretch!"
rejoined Nicholas fiercely. "Touch him at your peril. I will not stand by and see it done. My blood is up, and I have the strength of 10 such men as you. Look to yourself, for by heaven I will not spare you if you drive me on."
"Stand back!"
cried Squeers, brandishing his weapon. "I have a long series of insults to avenge," said Nicholas, flushed with passion, "and my indignation is aggravated by the dastardly cruelties practised on helpless infancy in this foul den. Have a care, for if you do raise the devil within me, the consequences shall fall heavily upon your own head." He had scarcely spoken when Squeers, in a violent outbreak of wrath, and with a cry like the howl of a wild beast, spat upon him and struck him a blow across the face with his instrument of torture, which raised up a bar of livid flesh as it was inflicted. Smarting with the agony of the blow, and concentrating into that one moment all his feelings of rage, scorn, and indignation, Nicholas sprang upon him, wrested the weapon from his hand, and pinning him by the throat, beat the ruffian till he roared for mercy. The boys, with the exception of Master Squeers, who, coming to his father's assistance, harassed the enemy in the rear, moved not hand or foot. But Mrs. Squeers, with many shrieks for aid, hung on to the tail of her partner's coat and endeavoured to drag him from his infuriated adversary, while Miss Squeers, who had been peeping through the keyhole in expectation of a very different scene, darted in at the very beginning of the attack, and after launching a shower of inkstands at the usher's head, beat Nicholas to her heart's content, animating herself at every blow with the recollection of his having refused her proffered love, and thus imparting additional strength to an arm which, as she took after her mother in this respect, was at no time one of the weakest. Nicholas, in the full torrent of his violence, felt the blows no more than if they had been dealt with feathers. But, becoming tired of the noise and uproar, and feeling that his arm grew weak besides, he threw all his remaining strength into 6 finishing cuts, and flung Squeers from him with all the force he could muster. The violence of his fall precipitated Mrs. Squeers completely over an adjacent form, and Squeers, striking his head against it in his descent, lay at his full length on the ground, stunned and motionless. Having brought affairs to this happy termination, and ascertained to his thorough satisfaction that Squeers was only stunned and not dead, upon which point he had had some unpleasant doubts at first, Nicholas left his family to restore him and retired to consider what course he had better adopt. He looked anxiously round for Smike as he left the room, but he was nowhere to be seen. After a brief consideration, he packed up a few clothes in a small leathern valise, and finding that nobody offered to oppose his progress, marched boldly out by the front door, and shortly afterwards struck into the road which led to Greta Bridge. When he had cooled sufficiently to be enabled to give his present circumstances some little reflection, they did not appear in a very encouraging light. He had only 4 shillings and a few pence in his pocket, and was something more than 250 miles from London, whither he resolved to direct his steps, that he might ascertain, among other things, what account of the morning's proceedings Mr. Squeers transmitted to his most affectionate uncle. Lifting up his eyes as he arrived at the conclusion that there was no remedy for this unfortunate state of things, he beheld a horseman coming towards him, whom, on nearer approach, he discovered, to his infinite chagrin, to be no other than Mr. John Browdie, who, clad in cords and leather leggings, was urging his animal forward by means of a thick ash stick which seemed to have been recently cut from some stout sapling. "I am in no mood for more noise and riot," thought Nicholas, "and yet, do what I will, I shall have an altercation with this honest blockhead, and perhaps a blow or two from yonder staff." In truth, there appeared some reason to expect that such a result would follow from the encounter, for John Browdie no sooner saw Nicholas advancing than he reined in his horse by the footpath and waited until such time as he should come up, looking meanwhile very sternly between the horse's ears at Nicholas as he came on at his leisure. "Servant, young gentleman," said John. "Yours," said Nicholas. "Well, we are met at last," observed John, making the stirrup ring under a smart touch of the ash-stick. "Yes," replied Nicholas, hesitating. "Come," he said frankly, after a moment's pause, "we parted on no very good terms the last time we met. It was my fault, I believe, but I had no intention of offending you, and no idea that I was doing so. I was very sorry for it afterwards. Will you shake hands?" "Shake hands?" cried the good-humoured Yorkshireman. "Ha, ha! That I will!" At the same time he bent down from the saddle and gave Nicholas's fist a huge wrench. "But what be the matter with thy face, mun? It be all broken like." "It is a cut," said Nicholas, turning scarlet as he spoke. "A blow, but I returned it to the giver, and with good interest too." "No, did he though?" exclaimed John Browdie. "Well, Dean, I like him for that." "The fact is," said Nicholas, not very well knowing how to make the avowal, "the fact is that I have been ill-treated." "No," interposed John Browdie in a tone of compassion, for he was a giant in strength and stature, and Nicholas, very likely in his eyes, seemed a mere dwarf. "Dean't say that." "Yes, I have," replied Nicholas, "by that man Squeers, and I have beaten him soundly, and am leaving this place in consequence." "What?" cried John Browdie with such an ecstatic shout that the horse quite shied at it. "Beaten the schoolmeasther?
Beaten the schoolmeasther! Who ever heard o' the like o' that noo? Give us thee hand again, youngster. Beaten the schoolmeasther! Dang it, I love thee for it.
With these expressions of delight, John Browdie laughed and laughed again, so loud that the echoes far and wide sent back nothing but jovial peals of merriment, and shook Nicholas by the hand meanwhile no less heartily. When his mirth had subsided, he inquired what Nicholas meant to do. On his informing him to go straight to London, he shook his head doubtfully and inquired if he knew how much the coaches charged to carry passengers so far. "No, I do not," said Nicholas, "but it is of no great consequence to me, for I intend walking."
"Gang awa' to Lunnon afoot?"
cried John in amazement. "Every step of the way," replied Nicholas. "I should be many steps further on by this time, and so good-bye."
"Nay, no,"
replied the honest countryman, reining in his impatient horse.
"Stand still, Telly. How much cash hast thee gotten?"
"Not much," said Nicholas, colouring, "but I can make it enough. Where there's a will, there's a way, you know." John Browdie made no verbal answer to this remark, but putting his hand in his pocket, pulled out an old purse of solid leather, and insisted that Nicholas should borrow from him whatever he required for his present necessities.
"Dean't be afeard, mun," he said. "Tak enough to carry thee home. Thee'lt pay me yon day, I warrant."
Nicholas could by no means be prevailed upon to borrow more than a sovereign, with which loan Mr. Browdie, after many entreaties that he would accept of more, observing with a touch of Yorkshire caution that if he didn't spend it all he could put the surplus by till he had an opportunity of remitting it carriage-free, was fain to content himself.
"Tak that bit o' timber to help thee on wi, mun," he added, pressing his stick on Nicholas and giving his hand another squeeze. "Keep a good heart, and bless thee. Beaten the schoolmeasther! God, it's the best thing I've heerd this 20 year." So saying, and indulging with more delicacy than might have been expected from him in another series of loud laughs for the purpose of avoiding the thanks which Nicholas poured forth, John Browdie set spurs to his horse and went off at a smart canter, looking back from time to time as Nicholas stood gazing after him and waving his hand cheerily as if to encourage him on his way. Nicholas watched the horse and rider until they disappeared over the brow of a distant hill, and then set forward on his journey. He did not travel far that afternoon, for by this time it was nearly dark, and there had been a heavy fall of snow, which not only rendered the way toilsome, but the track uncertain and difficult to find after daylight, save by experienced wayfarers. He lay that night at a cottage where beds were let at a cheap rate to the more humble class of travellers, and, rising betimes next morning, made his way before night to Boroughbridge. Passing through that town in search of some cheap resting-place, he stumbled upon an empty barn within a couple of 100 yards of the roadside, in a warm corner of which he stretched his weary limbs and soon fell asleep. When he awoke next morning and tried to recollect his dreams, which had been all connected with his recent sojourn at Dotheby Hall, he sat up, rubbed his eyes, and stared, not with the most composed countenance possible, at some motionless object which seemed to be stationed within a few yards in front of him. "Strange!" cried Nicholas. "Can this be some lingering creation of the visions that have scarcely left me? It cannot be real, and yet I am awake. Smike?" The form moved, rose, advanced, and dropped upon its knees at his feet. It was Smike indeed. "Why do you kneel to me?" said Nicholas, hastily raising him. "To go with you anywhere, everywhere, to the world's end, to the churchyard grave," replied Smike, clinging to his hand. "Let me, oh, do let me. You are my home, my kind friend. Take me with you, pray." "I am a friend who can do little for you," said Nicholas kindly. "How came you here?" He had followed him, it seemed, had never lost sight of him all the way,
had watched while he slept, and when he halted for refreshment and had feared to appear before lest he should be sent back, he had not intended to appear now, but Nicholas had awakened more suddenly than he looked for, and he had had no time to conceal himself. "Poor fellow!" said Nicholas. "Your hard fate denies you any friend but one, and he is nearly as poor and helpless as yourself." May I go with you?" asked Smike timidly. "I will be your faithful, hard-working servant. I will, indeed. I want no clothes," added the poor creature, drawing his rags together. "These will do very well. I only want to be near you." "And you shall," cried Nicholas, "and the world shall deal by you as it does by me, till one or both of us shall quit it for a better. Come!" With these words he strapped his burden on his shoulders, and, taking his stick in one hand, extended the other to his delighted charge, and so they passed out of the old barn together. Chapter 13. Of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 14. Having the misfortune to treat of none but common people is necessarily of a mean and vulgar character. In that quarter of London in which Golden Square is situated, there is a bygone, faded, tumble-down street with two irregular rows of tall, meagre houses which seem to have stared each other out of countenance years ago. The very chimneys appear to have grown dismal and melancholy from having had nothing better to look at than the chimneys over the way. Their tops are battered and broken and blackened with smoke, and here and there some taller stack than the rest, inclining heavily to one side and toppling over the roof, seems to meditate taking revenge for half a century's neglect by crushing the inhabitants of the garrets beneath. The fowls who peck about the kennels, jerking their bodies hither and thither with a gait which none but town fowls are ever seen to adopt, and which any country cock or hen would be puzzled to understand, are perfectly in keeping with the crazy habitations of their owners. Dingy, ill-plumed, drowsy flutterers, sent, like many of the neighbouring children, to get a livelihood in the streets, they hop from stone to stone in forlorn search of some hidden eatable in the mud, and can scarcely raise a crow among them. The only one with anything approaching to a voice is an aged bantam at the baker's, and even he is hoarse in consequence of bad living in his last place. To judge from the size of the houses, they have been at one time tenanted by persons of better condition than their present occupants, but they are now let off by the week in floors or rooms, and every door has almost as many plates or bell-handles as there are apartments within. The windows are, for the same reason, sufficiently diversified in appearance, being ornamented with every variety of common blind and curtain that can easily be imagined, while every doorway is blocked up and rendered nearly impassable by a motley collection of children and porter-pots of all sizes, from the baby in arms and the half-pint pot to the full-grown girl and a half-gallon can. In the parlour of one of these houses, which was perhaps a thought dirtier than any of its neighbours, which exhibited more bell-handles, children, and porter-pots, and caught in all its freshness the first gust of the thick black smoke that poured forth night and day from a large brewery hard by, hung a bill announcing that there was yet one room to let within its walls, though on what story the vacant room could be, regard being had to the outward tokens of many lodgers which the whole front displayed, from the mangle in the kitchen windows to the flower-pots on the parapet, it would have been beyond the power of a calculating boy to discover. The common stairs of this mansion were bare and carpetless, but a curious visitor who had to climb his way to the top might have observed that there were not wanting indications of the progressive poverty of the inmates, although their rooms were shut. Thus the first-floor lodgers, being flush of furniture, kept an old mahogany table, real mahogany, on the landing-place outside, which was only taken in when occasion required. On the second story, the spare furniture dwindled down to a couple of old deal chairs, of which one, belonging to the back room, was shorn of a leg and bottomless. The story above boasted no greater excess than a worm-eaten wash-tub, and the garret landing-place displayed no costlier articles than 2 crippled pitchers and some broken blacking bottles. It was on this garret landing-place that a hard-featured, square-faced man, elderly and shabby, stopped to unlock the door of the front attic, into which, having surmounted the task of turning the rusty key in its still more rusty wards, he walked with the air of legal owner. This person wore a wig of short, coarse, red hair, which he took off with his hat and hung upon a nail. Having adopted in its place a dirty cotton nightcap and groped about in the dark till he found a remnant of candle, he knocked at the partition which divided the 2 garrets and inquired in a loud voice whether Mr. Noggs had a light. The sounds that came back were stifled by the lath and plaster, and it seemed, moreover, as though the speaker had uttered them from the interior of a mug or other drinking vessel. But they were in the voice of Newman, and conveyed a reply in the affirmative.
"A nasty night, Mr. Noggs,"
said the man in the nightcap, stepping in to light his candle. "Does it rain?" asked Newman.
"Does it?"
replied the other pettishly.
"I'm wet through."
"It doesn't take much to wet you and me through, Mr. Crowle," said Newman, laying his hand upon the lapel of his threadbare coat.
"Well, and that makes it more vexatious,"
observed Mr. Crowle in the same pettish tone. Uttering a low, querulous growl, the speaker, whose harsh countenance was the very epitome of selfishness, raked the scanty fire nearly out of the grate, and, emptying the glass which Noggs had pushed towards him, inquired where he kept his coals. Newman Noggs pointed to the bottom of a cupboard, and Mr. Crowle, seizing the shovel, threw on half the stock, which Noggs very deliberately took off again without saying a word.
"You've not turned saving at this time of day, I hope?"
said Crowle. Newman pointed to the empty glass, as though it were a sufficient refutation of the charge, and briefly said that he was going downstairs to supper.
"To the Kenwigses?"
asked Crowle. Newman nodded assent.
"Think of that now," said Crowle. "If I didn't, thinking that you were certain not to go because you said you wouldn't, tell Kenwigs I couldn't come and make up my mind to spend the evening with you."
"I was obliged to go," said Newman. "They would have me."
"Well, but what's to become of me?"
urged the selfish man, who never thought of anybody else.
"It's all your fault. I'll tell you what. I'll sit by your fire till you come back again."
Newman cast a despairing glance at his small store of fuel, but, not having the courage to say no, a word which in all his life he never had said at the right time, either to himself or any one else, gave way to the proposed arrangement. Mr. Crowle immediately went about making himself as comfortable with Newman Noggs's means as circumstances would admit of his being made. The lodgers to whom Crowle had made allusion under the designation of the Kenwigses were the wife and olive branches of one Mr. Kenwigs, a turner in ivory, who was looked upon as a person of some consideration on the premises, inasmuch as he occupied the whole of the first floor, comprising a suite of 2 rooms. Mrs. Kenwigs, too, was quite a lady in her manners and of a very genteel family, having an uncle who collected a water rate. Besides which distinction, the 2 eldest of her little girls went twice a week to a dancing school in the neighbourhood, and had flaxen hair tied with blue ribbons, hanging in luxuriant pigtails down their backs, and wore little white trousers with frills round the ankles. For all of which reasons, and many more equally valid but too numerous to mention, Mrs. Kenwigs was considered a very desirable person to know, and was the constant theme of all the gossips in the street, and even 3 or 4 doors round the corner, at both ends. It was the anniversary of that happy day on which the Church of England, as by law established, had bestowed Mrs. Kenwigs upon Mr. Kenwigs, and in grateful commemoration of the same, Mrs. Kenwigs had invited a few select friends to cards and a supper in the first floor, and had put on a new gown to receive them in, which gown, being of a flaming colour and made upon a juvenile principle, was so successful that Mr. Kenwigs said the 8 years of matrimony and the 5 children seemed all a dream, and Mrs. Kenwigs younger and more blooming than on the very first Sunday he had kept company with her. Beautiful as Mrs. Kenwigs looked when she was dressed, though, and so stately that you would have supposed she had a cook and a housemaid at least, and nothing to do but order them about, she had a world of trouble with the preparations. More, indeed, than she, being of a delicate and genteel constitution, could have sustained had not the pride of housewifery upheld her. At last, however, all the things that had to be got together were got together, and all the things that had to be got out of the way were got out of the way, and everything was ready, and the collector himself having promised to come, fortune smiled upon the occasion. The party was admirably selected. There were, first of all, Mr. Kenwigs and Mrs. Kenwigs and 4 Olive Kenwigses, who sat up to supper, firstly because it was but right that they should have a treat on such a day, and secondly because their going to bed in presence of the company would have been inconvenient, not to say improper. Then there was a young lady who had made Mrs. Kenwigs's dress, and who, it was the most convenient thing in the world, living in the 2-pair back, gave up her bed to the baby and got a little girl to watch it. Then to match this young lady was a young man who had known Mr. Kenwigs when he was a bachelor, and was much esteemed by the ladies as bearing the reputation of a rake. To these were added a newly married couple who had visited Mr. and Mrs. Kenwigs in their courtship, and a sister of Mrs. Kenwigs's who was quite a beauty, besides whom there was another young man supposed to entertain honourable designs upon the lady last mentioned, and Mr. Noggs, who was a genteel person to ask because he had been a gentleman once. There were also an elderly lady from the back parlour, and one more young lady, who, next to the collector perhaps, was the great lion of the party, being the daughter of a theatrical fireman, who went on in the pantomime and had the greatest turn for the stage that was ever known, being able to sing and recite in a manner that brought the tears into Mrs. Kenwigs's eyes. There was only one drawback upon the pleasure of seeing such friends, and that was that the lady in the back parlour, who was very fat and turned of 60, came in a low book muslin dress and short kid gloves, which so exasperated Mrs. Kenwigs that that lady assured her visitors, in private, that if it hadn't happened that the supper was cooking at the back parlour grate at that moment, she certainly would have requested its representative to withdraw.
"My dear," said Mr. Kenwigs, "wouldn't it be better to begin a round game?" "Kenwigs, my dear," returned his wife, "I am surprised at you. Would you begin without my uncle?"
"I forgot the collector," said Kenwigs. "Oh, no, that would never do."
"He's so particular," said Mrs. Kenwigs, turning to the other married lady, "that if we began without him, I should be out of his will for ever."
"Dear!" cried the married lady.
"You've no idea what he is," replied Mrs. Kenwigs, "and yet as good a creature as ever breathed."
"The kindest-hearted man as ever was," said Kenwigs. "It goes to his heart, I believe, to be forced to cut the water off when the people don't pay," observed the bachelor friend, intending a joke. "George," said Mr. Kenwigs solemnly, "none of that, if you please." "It was only my joke," said the friend, abashed. "George," rejoined Mr. Kenwigs, "a joke is a wery good thing, a wery good thing, but when that joke is made at the expense of Mrs. Kenwigs's feelings, I set my face against it. A man in public life expects to be sneered at. It is the fault of his elewated situation, and not of himself. Mrs. Kenwigs' relation is a public man, and that he knows, George, and that he can bear. But putting Mrs. Kenwigs out of the question, if I could put Mrs. Kenwigs out of the question on such an occasion as this, I have the honour to be connected with the collector by marriage, and I cannot allow these remarks in my—" Mr. Kenwigs was going to say house, but he rounded the sentence with apartments. At the conclusion of these observations, which drew forth evidences of acute feeling from Mrs. Kenwigs and had the intended effect of impressing the company with a deep sense of the collector's dignity, a ring was heard at the bell. "That's him," whispered Mr. Kenwigs, greatly excited. "Morleena, my dear, run down and let your uncle in, and kiss him directly you get the door open. Let's be talking." Adopting Mr. Kenwigs's suggestion, the company spoke very loudly to look easy and unembarrassed, and almost as soon as they had begun to do so, a short old gentleman in drabs and gaiters, with a face that might have been carved out of lignum vitae, for anything that appeared to the contrary, was led playfully in by Miss Morleena Kenwigs, regarding whose uncommon Christian name it may be here remarked that it had been invented and composed by Mrs. Kenwigs previous to her first lying in, for the special distinction of her eldest child, in case it should prove a daughter.
"Oh, uncle, I'm so glad to see you," said Mrs. Kenwigs, kissing the collector affectionately on both cheeks. "So glad."
"Many happy returns of the day, my dear," replied the collector, returning the compliment. Now, this was an interesting thing. Here was a collector of water rates, without his book, without his pen and ink, without his double knock, without his intimidation, kissing, actually kissing, an agreeable female, and leaving taxes, summonses, notices that he had called, or announcement that he would never call again, for 2/4 due, wholly out of the question. It was pleasant to see how the company looked on, quite absorbed in the sight, and to behold the nods and winks with which they expressed their gratification at finding so much humanity in a tax-gatherer.
"Where will you sit, uncle?"
said Mrs. Kenwigs, in the full glow of family pride which the appearance of her distinguished relation occasioned. "Anywheres, my dear," said the collector. "I'm not particular."
Not particular? What a meek collector! If he had been an author who knew his place, he couldn't have been more humble. "Mr. Lillyvick," said Kenwigs, addressing the collector.
"Some friends here, sir, are very anxious for the honour of thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Cutler, Mr. Lillyvick."
"Proud to know you, sir,"
said Mr. Cutler. "I've heard of you very often." These were not mere words of ceremony, for Mr. Cutler, having kept house in Mr. Lillyvick's parish, had heard of him very often indeed. His attention in calling had been quite extraordinary. "George, you know, I think, Mr. Lillyvick," said Kenwigs. "Lady from downstairs, Mr. Lillyvick. Mr. Snooks, Mr. Lillyvick. Miss Green, Mr. Lillyvick. Mr. Lillyvick, Miss Petowker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Very glad to make 2 public characters acquainted. Mrs. Kenwigs, my dear, will you sort the counters?" Mrs. Kenwigs, with the assistance of Newman Noggs, who, as he performed sundry little acts of kindness for the children at all times and seasons, was humoured in his request to be taken no notice of, and was merely spoken about, in a whisper, as the decayed gentleman, did as he was desired, and the greater part of the guests sat down to speculation, while Newman himself, Mrs. Kenwigs, and Miss Petowker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, looked after the supper-table. While the ladies were thus busying themselves, Mr. Lillyvick was intent upon the game in progress, and as all should be fish that comes to a water-collector's net, the dear old gentleman was by no means scrupulous in appropriating to himself the property of his neighbours, which, on the contrary, he abstracted whenever an opportunity presented itself, smiling good-humouredly all the while and making so many condescending speeches to the owners that they were delighted with his amiability and thought in their hearts that he deserved to be Chancellor of the Exchequer at least. After a great deal of trouble and the administration of many slaps on the head to the infant Kenwigses, whereof 2 of the most rebellious were summarily banished, the cloth was laid with much elegance, and a pair of boiled fowls, a large piece of pork, apple pie, potatoes, and greens were served, at sight of which the worthy Mr. Lillyvick vented a great many witticisms and plucked up amazingly, to the immense delight and satisfaction of the whole body of admirers. Very well and very fast the supper went off, no more serious difficulties occurring than those which arose from the incessant demand for clean knives and forks, which made poor Mrs. Kenwigs wish more than once that private society adopted the principle of schools and required that every guest should bring his own knife, fork, and spoon, which doubtless would be a great accommodation in many cases, and to no one more so than to the lady and gentleman of the house, especially if the school principle were carried out to the full extent, and the articles were expected as a matter of delicacy not to be taken away again. Everybody having eaten everything, the table was cleared in a most alarming hurry, and with great noise, and the spirits, whereat the eyes of Newman Noggs glistened, being arranged in order, with water both hot and cold, the party composed themselves for conviviality. Mr. Lillyvick being stationed in a large arm-chair by the fireside, and the four little Kenwigses disposed on a small form in front of the company with their flaxen tails towards them and their faces to the fire, an arrangement which no sooner perfected than Mrs. Kenwigs was overpowered by the feelings of a mother and fell upon the left shoulder of Mr. Kenwigs, dissolved in tears.
"Oh, they are so beautiful!"
said Mrs. Kenwigs, sobbing. "Oh, dear," said all the ladies, "so they are. It's very natural you should feel proud of that. But don't give way. Don't."
"I can not help it, and it don't signify," sobbed Mrs. Kenwigs. "Oh, they're too beautiful to live. Much too beautiful."
On hearing this alarming presentiment of their being doomed to an early death in the flower of their infancy, all four little girls raised a hideous cry, and burying their heads in their mother's lap simultaneously, screamed until the 8 flaxen tails vibrated again. Mrs. Kenwigs meanwhile clasping them alternately to her bosom, with attitudes expressive of distraction which Miss Petowker herself might have copied. At length the anxious mother permitted herself to be soothed into a more tranquil state, and the little Kenwigses, being also composed, were distributed among the company to prevent the possibility of Mrs. Kenwigs being again overcome by the blaze of their combined beauty. This done, the ladies and gentlemen united in prophesying that they would live for many, many years, and that there was no occasion at all for Mrs. Kenwigs to distress herself, which in good truth there did not appear to be, the loveliness of the children by no means justifying her apprehensions. "This day 8 year," said Mr. Kenwigs after a pause. "Dear me! Ah!" This reflection was echoed by all present, who said "ah" first and "dear me" afterwards.
"I was younger then," tittered Mrs. Kenwigs.
"No," said the collector. "Certainly not," added everybody. "I remember my niece," said Mr. Lillyvick, surveying his audience with a grave air. "I remember her, on that very afternoon, when she first acknowledged to her mother a partiality for Kenwigs. 'Mother,' she says, 'I love him.'"
"Adore him, I said, uncle,"
interposed Mrs. Kenwigs. "Love him, I think, my dear," said the collector firmly.
"Perhaps you're right, uncle,"
replied Mrs. Kenwigs submissively.
"I thought it was adore."
"Love, my dear," retorted Mr. Lillyvick. "Mother," she says, "I love him." "What do I hear?" cries her mother, and instantly falls into strong convulsions. A general exclamation of astonishment burst from the company. "Into strong convulsions," repeated Mr. Lillyvick, regarding them with a rigid look. "Kenwigs will excuse my saying, in the presence of friends, that there was a very great objection to him, on the ground that he was beneath the family and would disgrace it. You remember, Kenwigs?" "Certainly," replied that gentleman, in no way displeased at the reminiscence, inasmuch as it proved beyond all doubt what a high family Mrs. Kenwigs came from. "I share in that feeling," said Mr. Lillyvick. "Perhaps it was natural, perhaps it wasn't." A gentle murmur seemed to say that, in one of Mr. Lillyvick's station, the objection was not only natural but highly praiseworthy. "I came round to him in time," said Mr. Lillyvick, "after they were married, and there was no help for it. I was one of the first to say that Kenwigs must be taken notice of. The family did take notice of him in consequence, and on my representation I am bound to say and proud to say that I have always found him a very honest, well-behaved, upright, respectable sort of man. Kenwigs, shake hands." "I'm proud to do it, sir," said Mr. Kenwigs. "So am I, Kenwigs," rejoined Mr. Lillyvick. "A very happy life I have led with your niece, sir," said Kenwigs. "It would have been your own fault if you had not, sir," remarked Mr. Lillyvick.
"Morleena Kenwigs,"
cried her mother at this crisis, much affected,
"kiss your dear uncle."
The young lady did as she was requested, and the 3 other little girls were successively hoisted up to the collector's countenance and subjected to the same process, which was afterwards repeated on them by the majority of those present.
"Oh, dear, Mrs. Kenwigs,"
said Miss Petowker. "While Mr. Noggs is making that punch to drink happy returns in, do let Morleena go through that figure dance before Mr. Lillyvick." "Oh, no, no, my dear," replied Mrs. Kenwigs. "It will only worry my uncle." "It can't worry him, I am sure," said Miss Petowker. "You'll be very much pleased, won't you, sir?" "That I'm sure I shall," replied the collector, glancing at the punch-mixer.
"Well, then, I'll tell you what," said Mrs. Kenwigs. "Morleena shall do the steps if uncle can persuade Miss Petowker to recite us the blood-drinker's burial afterwards."
There was a great clapping of hands and stamping of feet at this proposition, the subject whereof gently inclined her head several times in acknowledgment of the reception. "You know," said Miss Petowker reproachfully, "that I dislike doing anything professional in private parties."
"Oh, but not here," said Mrs. Kenwigs. "We're all so very friendly and pleasant that you might as well be going through it in your own room. Besides, the occasion—"
"I can't resist that," interrupted Miss Petowker. "Anything in my humble power I shall be delighted to do." Mrs. Kenwigs and Miss Petowker had arranged a small programme of the entertainments between them, of which this was the prescribed order, but they had settled to have a little pressing on both sides because it looked more natural. The company being all ready, Miss Petowker hummed a tune and Morleena danced a dance, having previously had the soles of her shoes chalked with as much care as if she were going on the tight-rope. It was a very beautiful figure, comprising a great deal of work for the arms, and was received with unbounded applause. "If I was blessed with a child," said Miss Petowker, blushing, "of such genius as that, I would have her out at the opera instantly." Mrs. Kenwigs sighed and looked at Mr. Kenwigs, who shook his head and observed that he was doubtful about it.
"Kenwigs is afraid," said Mrs. K.
"What of?" inquired Miss Petowker. "Not of her failing?"
"Oh, no,"
replied Mrs. Kenwigs,
"but if she grew up what she is now, only think of the young dukes and marquises."
"Very right," said the collector.
"Still," submitted Miss Petowker, "if she took a proper pride in herself, you know—" "There's a good deal in that," observed Mrs. Kenwigs, looking at her husband. "I only know," faltered Miss Petowker, "it may be no rule to be sure, but I have never found any inconvenience or unpleasantness of that sort." Mr. Kenwigs, with becoming gallantry, said that settled the question at once, and that he would take the subject into his serious consideration. This being resolved upon, Miss Petowker was entreated to begin the blood-drinker's burial, to which end that young lady let down her back hair, and taking up her position at the other end of the room, with the bachelor friend posted in a corner to rush out at the cue "In Death Expire" and catch her in his arms when she died raving mad, went through the performance with extraordinary spirit and to the great terror of the little Kenwigses, who were all but frightened into fits. The ecstasies consequent upon the effort had not yet subsided, and Newman, who had not been thoroughly sober at so late an hour for a long, long time, had not yet been able to put in a word of announcement that the punch was ready, when a hasty knock was heard at the room door, which elicited a shriek from Mrs. Kenwigs, who immediately divined that the baby had fallen out of bed. "Who is that?" demanded Mr. Kenwigs sharply. "Don't be alarmed. It's only me," said Crowl, looking in his nightcap. "The baby's very comfortable, for I peeped into the room as I came down, and it's fast asleep, and so is the girl. I don't think the candle will set fire to the bed curtain unless a draught was to get into the room. It's Mr. Noggs that's wanted." "Me?" cried Newman, much astonished. "Why, it is a queer hour, isn't it?" replied Crowl, who was not best pleased at the prospect of losing his fire. "And they're queer-looking people, too, all covered with rain and mud. Shall I tell them to go away?"
"No," said Newman, rising. "People? How many?"
"2," rejoined Crowl.
"Want me? By name?" asked Newman.
"By name," replied Crowl. "Mr. Newman Noggs, as pat as need be."
Newman reflected for a few seconds and then hurried away, muttering that he would be back directly. He was as good as his word, for in an exceedingly short time he burst into the room and, seizing without a word of apology or explanation a lighted candle and tumbler of hot punch from the table, darted away like a madman.
"What the deuce is the matter with him?" exclaimed Crowl, throwing the door open. "Hark! Is there any noise above?"
The guests rose in great confusion and, looking in each other's faces with much perplexity and some fear, stretched their necks forward and listened attentively. Chapter 14. Of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 15. Acquaints the reader with the cause and origin of the interruption described in the last chapter, and with some other matters necessary to be known. Newman Noggs scrambled in violent haste upstairs with the steaming beverage, which he had so unceremoniously snatched from the table of Mr. Kenwigs, and indeed from the very grasp of the water-rate collector, who was eyeing the contents of the tumbler at the moment of its unexpected abstraction with lively marks of pleasure visible in his countenance. He bore his prize straight to his own back garret, where, footsore and nearly shoeless, wet, dirty, jaded, and disfigured with every mark of fatiguing travel, sat Nicholas and Smike, at once the cause and partner of his toil, both perfectly worn out by their unwonted and protracted exertion. Newman's first act was to compel Nicholas, with gentle force, to swallow half of the punch at a breath, nearly boiling as it was, and his next to pour the remainder down the throat of Smike, who, never having tasted anything stronger than aperient medicine in his whole life, exhibited various odd manifestations of surprise and delight during the passage of the liquor down his throat, and turned up his eyes most emphatically when it was all gone. "You are wet through," said Newman, passing his hand hastily over the coat which Nicholas had thrown off, "and I haven't even a change," he added with a wistful glance at the shabby clothes he wore himself. "I have dry clothes, or at least such as will serve my turn well in my bundle," replied Nicholas. "If you look so distressed to see me, you will add to the pain I feel already at being compelled for one night to cast myself upon your slender means for aid and shelter." Newman did not look the less distressed to hear Nicholas talking in this strain, but upon his young friend grasping him heartily by the hand and assuring him that nothing but implicit confidence in the sincerity of his professions and kindness of feeling towards himself would have induced him on any consideration even to have made him acquainted with his arrival in London, Mr. Noggs brightened up again and went about making such arrangements as were in his power for the comfort of his visitors with extreme alacrity. These were simple enough, poor Newman's means halting at a very considerable distance short of his inclinations, but slight as they were not made without much bustling and running about. As Nicholas had husbanded his scanty stock of money so well that it was not yet quite expended, a supper of bread and cheese, with some cold beef from the cook's shop, was soon placed upon the table, and these viands being flanked by a bottle of spirits and a pot of porter, there was no ground for apprehension on the score of hunger or thirst, at all events. Such preparations as Newman had it in his power to make for the accommodation of his guests during the night occupied no very great time in completing, and as he had insisted as an express preliminary that Nicholas should change his clothes and that Smike should invest himself in his solitary coat, which no entreaties would dissuade him from stripping off for the purpose, the travellers partook of their frugal fare with more satisfaction than one of them at least had derived from many a better meal. They then drew near the fire, which Newman Noggs had made up as well as he could after the inroads of Crowl upon the fuel, and Nicholas, who had hitherto been restrained by the extreme anxiety of his friend that he should refresh himself after his journey, now pressed him with earnest questions concerning his mother and sister. "Well," returned Newman with his accustomed taciturnity. "Both well?" "They are living in the city still?" inquired Nicholas. "They are," said Newman. "And my sister?" added Nicholas. "Is she still engaged in the business which she wrote to tell me she thought she should like so much?" Newman opened his eyes rather wider than usual, but merely replied by a gasp, which, according to the action of the head that accompanied it, was interpreted by his friends as meaning yes or no. In the present instance the pantomime consisted of a nod and not a shake, so Nicholas took the answer as a favourable one. "Now, listen to me," said Nicholas, laying his hand on Newman's shoulder. "Before I would make an effort to see them, I deemed it expedient to come to you, lest by gratifying my own selfish desire I should inflict an injury upon them which I can never repair. What has my uncle heard from Yorkshire?" Newman opened and shut his mouth several times, as though he were trying his utmost to speak, but could make nothing of it, and finally fixed his eyes on Nicholas with a grim and ghastly stare. "What has he heard?" urged Nicholas, colouring. "You see that I am prepared to hear the very worst that malice can have suggested. Why should you conceal it from me? I must know it sooner or later, and what purpose can be gained by trifling with the matter for a few minutes, when half the time would put me in possession of all that has occurred? Tell me at once, pray." "To-morrow morning," said Newman. "Hear it to-morrow." "What purpose would that answer?" urged Nicholas. "You would sleep the better," replied Newman. "I should sleep the worse," answered Nicholas impatiently. "Sleep? Exhausted as I am, and standing in no common need of rest, I cannot hope to close my eyes all night unless you tell me everything." "And if I should tell you everything," said Newman, hesitating, "why, then you may rouse my indignation or wound my pride," rejoined Nicholas, "but you will not break my rest. For if the scene were acted over again, I could take no other part than I have taken, and whatever consequences may accrue to myself from it, I shall never regret doing as I have done. Never, if I starve or beg in consequence. What is a little poverty or suffering to the disgrace of the basest and most inhuman cowardice? I tell you, if I had stood by tamely and passively, I should have hated myself and merited the contempt of every man in existence. The black-hearted scoundrel!" With this gentle allusion to the absent Mr. Squeers, Nicholas repressed his rising wrath, and relating to Newman exactly what had passed at Dotheby Hall, entreated him to speak out without more pressing. Thus adjured, Mr. Noggs took from an old trunk a sheet of paper which appeared to have been scrawled over in great haste, and after sundry extraordinary demonstrations of reluctance, delivered himself in the following terms. "My dear young man, you mustn't give way to this sort of thing will never do, you know, after getting on in the world if you take everybody's part that's ill-treated. Damn it, I am proud to hear of it, and would have done it myself." Newman accompanied this very unusual outbreak with a violent blow upon the table, as if, in the heat of the moment, he had mistaken it for the chest or ribs of Mr. Wackford Squeers. Having by this open declaration of his feelings quite precluded himself from offering Nicholas any cautious worldly advice, which had been his first intention, Mr. Noggs went straight to the point. "The day before yesterday," said Newman, "your uncle received this letter. I took a hasty copy of it while he was out. Shall I read it?" "If you please," replied Nicholas. Newman Noggs accordingly read as follows. "Dotheby Hall, Thursday morning. Sir, my pa requests me to write to you, the doctors considering it doubtful whether he will ever recover the use of his legs, which prevents his holding a pen. We are in a state of mind beyond everything, and my pa is one mask of bruises, both blue and green, likewise. 2 forms are steepled in his gore. We were compelled to have him carried down into the kitchen, where he now lays. You will judge from this that he has been brought very low. When your nephew that you recommended for a teacher had done this to my pa and jumped upon his body with his feet
and also language, which I will not pollute my pen with describing, he assaulted my ma with dreadful violence, dashed her to the earth, and drove her back comb several inches into her head. A very little more, and it must have entered her skull. We have a medical certificate that if it had, the tortoise-shell would have affected the brain. Me and my brother were then the victims of his fury, since which we have suffered very much, which leads us to the harrowing belief that we have received some injury in our insides, especially as no marks of violence are visible externally. I am screaming out loud all the time I write, and so is my brother, which takes off my attention rather, and I hope will excuse mistakes. The monster, having satiated his thirst for blood, ran away, taking with him a boy of desperate character that he had excited to rebellion, and a garnet ring belonging to my ma, and not having been apprehended by the constables, is supposed to have been took up by some stage-coach. My pa begs that if he comes to you, the ring may be returned, and that you will let the thief and assassin go, as if we prosecuted him he would only be transported, and if he is let go he is sure to be hung before long, which will save us trouble and be much more satisfactory. Hoping to hear from you when convenient, I remain yours and cetera, Fanny Squeers. P.S. I pity his ignorance and despise him. A profound silence succeeded to the reading of this choice epistle, during which Newman Noggs, as he folded it up, gazed with a kind of grotesque pity at the boy of desperate character therein referred to, who, having no more distinct perception of the matter in hand than that he had been the unfortunate cause of heaping trouble and falsehood upon Nicholas, sat mute and dispirited, with a most woebegone and heart-stricken look. "Mr. Noggs," said Nicholas after a few moments' reflection, "I must go out at once." "Go out?" cried Newman. "Yes," said Nicholas, "to Golden Square. Nobody who knows me would believe this story of the ring, but it may suit the purpose, or gratify the hatred of Mr. Ralph Nickleby, to feign to attach credence to it. It is due not to him, but to myself, that I should state the truth, and moreover, I have a word or two to exchange with him which will not keep cool." "They must," said Newman. "They must not indeed," rejoined Nicholas firmly as he prepared to leave the house. "Hear me speak," said Newman, planting himself before his impetuous young friend. "He's not there. He's away from town. He will not be back for 3 days, and I know that letter will not be answered before he returns." "Are you sure of this?" asked Nicholas, chafing violently and pacing the narrow room with rapid strides. "Quite," rejoined Newman. "He had hardly read it when he was called away. Its contents are known to nobody but himself and us." "Are you certain?" demanded Nicholas precipitately. "Not even to my mother or sister? If I thought that they I will go there. I must see them. Which is the way? Where is it?" "Now, be advised by me," said Newman, speaking for the moment in his earnestness like any other man. "Make no effort to see even them till he comes home. I know the man. Do not seem to have been tampering with anybody. When he returns, go straight to him and speak as boldly as you like, guessing at the real truth. He knows it as well as you or I. Trust him for that." "You mean well to me, and should know him better than I can," replied Nicholas after some consideration. "Well, let it be so." Newman, who had stood during the foregoing conversation with his back planted against the door, ready to oppose any egress from the apartment by force if necessary, resumed his seat with much satisfaction, and as the water in the kettle was by this time boiling, made a glassful of spirits and water for Nicholas and a cracked mugful for the joint accommodation of himself and Smike, of which the two partook in great harmony, while Nicholas, leaning his head upon his hand, remained buried in melancholy meditation. Meanwhile, the company below stairs, after listening attentively and not hearing any noise which would justify them in interfering for the gratification of their curiosity, returned to the chamber of the Kenwigses and employed themselves in hazarding a great variety of conjectures relative to the cause of Mr. Noggs's sudden disappearance and detention.
"Lor, I tell you what,"
said Mrs. Kenwigs. "Suppose it should be an express sent up to say that his property has all come back again?"
"Dear me," said Mr. Kenwigs, "it's not impossible. Perhaps in that case we better send up and ask if he won't take a little more punch." "Kenwigs," said Mr. Lillyvick in a loud voice, "I'm surprised at you."
"What's the matter, sir?" asked Mr. Kenwigs with becoming submission to the collector of water rates.
"Making such a remark as that, sir?" replied Mr. Lillyvick angrily. "He has had punch already, has he not, sir? I consider the way in which that punch was cut off, if I may use the expression, highly disrespectful to this company, scandalous, perfectly scandalous. It may be the custom to allow such things in this house, but it's not the kind of behaviour that I've been used to see displayed, and so I don't mind telling you, Kenwigs. A gentleman has a glass of punch before him to which he is just about to set his lips, when another gentleman comes and collars that glass of punch without a with your leave or by your leave, and carries that glass of punch away. This may be good manners, I dare say it is, but I don't understand it, that's all, and what's more, I don't care if I never do. It's my way to speak my mind, Kenwigs, and that is my mind, and if you don't like it, it's past my regular time for going to bed, and I can find my way home without making it later." Here was an untoward event. The collector had sat swelling and fuming in offended dignity for some minutes, and had now fairly burst out. The great man, the rich relation, the unmarried uncle, who had it in his power to make Morleena an heiress and the very baby a legatee, was offended. Gracious powers, where was this to end? "I am very sorry, sir," said Mr. Kenwigs humbly. "Don't tell me you're sorry," retorted Mr. Lillyvick with much sharpness. "You should have prevented it then." The company were quite paralysed by this domestic crash. The back parlour sat with her mouth wide open, staring vacantly at the collector in a stupor of dismay. The other guests were scarcely less overpowered by the great man's irritation. Mr. Kenwigs, not being skilful in such matters, only fanned the flame in attempting to extinguish it. "I didn't think of it, I'm sure, sir," said that gentleman. "I didn't suppose that such a little thing as a glass of punch would have put you out of temper." "Out of temper! What the devil do you mean by that piece of impertinence, Mr. Kenwigs?" said the collector. "Morleena, child, give me my hat."
"Oh, you're not going, Mr. Lillyvick, sir?" interposed Miss Petowker with her most bewitching smile. But still Mr. Lillyvick, regardless of the siren, cried obdurately, "Morleena, my hat!" Upon the fourth repetition of which demand, Mrs. Kenwigs sunk back in her chair with a cry that might have softened a water-butt, not to say a water-collector, while the four little girls, privately instructed to that effect, clasped their uncle's drab shorts in their arms and prayed him in imperfect English to remain. "Why should I stop here, my dears?" said Mr. Lillyvick. "I am not wanted here." "Oh, do not speak so cruelly, uncle," sobbed Mrs. Kenwigs, "unless you wish to kill me."
"I shouldn't wonder if some people were to say I did," replied Mr. Lillyvick, glancing angrily at Kenwigs. "Out of temper."
"Oh, I cannot bear to see him look so at my husband," cried Mrs. Kenwigs. "He's so dreadful in families. Oh!"
"Mr. Lillyvick," said Kenwigs, "I hope, for the sake of your niece, that you won't object to be reconciled." The collector's features relaxed as the company added their entreaties to those of his nephew-in-law. He gave up his hat and held out his hand. "There, Kenwigs," said Mr. Lillyvick, "and let me tell you, at the same time, to show you how much out of temper I was, that if I had gone away without another word, it would have made no difference respecting that pound or two which I shall leave among your children when I die."
"Morleena Kenwigs," cried her mother in a torrent of affection, "go down upon your knees to your dear uncle and beg him to love you all his life through, for he's more an angel than a man, and I've always said so." Miss Morleena, approaching to do homage in compliance with this injunction, was summarily caught up and kissed by Mr. Lillyvick, and thereupon Mrs. Kenwigs darted forward and kissed the collector, and an irrepressible murmur of applause broke from the company who had witnessed his magnanimity. The worthy gentleman then became once more the life and soul of the society, Being again reinstated in his old post of lion, from which high station the temporary distraction of their thoughts had for a moment dispossessed him. Quadruped lions are said to be savage only when they are hungry. Biped lions are rarely sulky longer than when their appetite for distinction remains unappeased. Mr. Lillyvick stood higher than ever, for he had shown his power, hinted at his property and testamentary intentions, gained great credit for disinterestedness and virtue, and in addition to all was finally accommodated with a much larger tumbler of punch than that which Newman Noggs had so feloniously made off with. "I say, I beg everybody's pardon for intruding again," said Crowl, looking in at this happy juncture, "but what a queer business this is, isn't it? Noggs has lived in this house now going on for 5 years, and nobody has ever been to see him before within the memory of the oldest inhabitant." "It's a strange time of night to be called away, sir, certainly," said the collector, "and the behaviour of Mr. Noggs himself is, to say the least of it, mysterious."
"Well, so it is," rejoined Crowl, "and I'll tell you what's more. I think these two geniuses, whoever they are, have run away from somewhere."
"What makes you think that, sir?" demanded the collector, who seemed by a tacit understanding to have been chosen an elected mouthpiece to the company. "You have no reason to suppose that they have run away from anywhere without paying the rates and taxes due, I hope?" Mr. Crowl, with a look of some contempt, was about to enter a general protest against the payment of rates or taxes under any circumstances when he was checked by a timely whisper from Kenwigs and several frowns and winks from Mrs. K, which providentially stopped him. "Why, the fact is," said Crowl, who had been listening at Newman's door with all his might and main, "the fact is that they have been talking so loud that they quite disturbed me in my room, and so I couldn't help catching a word here and a word there, and all I heard certainly seemed to refer to their having bolted from some place or other. I don't wish to alarm Mrs. Kenwigs, but I hope they haven't come from any jail or hospital and brought away a fever or some unpleasantness of that sort which might be catching for the children." Mrs. Kenwigs was so overpowered by this supposition that it needed all the tender attentions of Miss Petowker of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane to restore her to anything like a state of calmness, not to mention the assiduity of Mr. Kenwigs, who held a fat smelling-bottle to his lady's nose until it became matter of some doubt whether the tears which coursed down her face were the result of feelings or sal volatile. The ladies, having expressed their sympathy, singly and separately, fell, according to custom, into a little chorus of soothing expressions, among which such condolences as "Poor dear! I should feel just the same if I was her," "To be sure it's a very trying thing," and "Nobody but a mother knows what a mother's feelings is," were among the most prominent and most frequently repeated. In short, the opinion of the company was so clearly manifested that Mr. Kenwigs was on the point of repairing to Mr. Noggs's room to demand an explanation, and had indeed swallowed a preparatory glass of punch with great inflexibility and steadiness of purpose, when the attention of all present was diverted by a new and terrible surprise. This was nothing less than the sudden pouring forth of a rapid succession of the shrillest and most piercing screams from an upper story, and to all appearance from the very two-pair back in which the infant Kenwigs was at the moment enshrined. They were no sooner audible than Mrs. Kenwigs, opining that a strange cat had come in and sucked the baby's breath while the girl was asleep, made for the door, wringing her hands and shrieking dismally, to the great consternation and confusion of the company. "Mr. Kenwigs, see what it is! Make haste!" cried the sister, laying violent hands upon Mrs. Kenwigs and holding her back by force. "Oh, don't twist so, dear, or I can never hold you." "My baby! My blessed, 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 blessed baby!" screamed Mrs. Kenwigs, making every blessed louder than the last. "My own darling, sweet, innocent Lillyvick! Oh, let me go to him! Let me go!" Pending the utterance of these frantic cries and the wails and lamentations of the four little girls, Mr. Kenwigs rushed upstairs to the room whence the sounds proceeded, at the door of which he encountered Nicholas, with the child in his arms, who darted out with such violence that the anxious father was thrown down 6 stairs and alighted on the nearest landing-place before he had time to open his mouth to ask what was the matter. "Don't be alarmed," cried Nicholas, running down. "Here it is. It's all out. It's all over. Pray compose yourselves. There's no harm done." And with these and 1,000 other assurances he delivered the baby, whom in his hurry he had carried upside down, to Mrs. Kenwigs, and ran back to assist Mr. Kenwigs, who was rubbing his head very hard and looking much bewildered by his tumble. Reassured by this cheering intelligence, the company in some degree recovered from their fears, which had been productive of some most singular instances of a total want of presence of mind. Thus the bachelor friend had, for a long time, supported in his arms Mrs. Kenwigs's sister instead of Mrs. Kenwigs, and the worthy Mr. Lillyvick had been actually seen, in the perturbation of his spirits, to kiss Miss Petowker several times behind the room door, as calmly as if nothing distressing were going forward. "It is a mere nothing," said Nicholas, returning to Mrs. Kenwigs. "The little girl who was watching the child, being tired, I suppose, fell asleep and set her hair on fire."
"Oh, you malicious little wretch!" cried Mrs. Kenwigs, impressively shaking her forefinger at the small unfortunate, who might be 13 years old, and was looking on with a singed head and a frightened face. "I heard her cries," continued Nicholas, "and ran down in time to prevent her setting fire to anything else. You may depend upon it that the child is not hurt, for I took it off the bed myself and brought it here to convince you." This brief explanation over, the infant who, as he was christened after the collector, rejoiced in the names of Lillyvick Kenwigs, was partially suffocated under the caresses of the audience and squeezed to his mother's bosom until he roared again. The attention of the company was then directed, by a natural transition, to the little girl who had had the audacity to burn her hair off, and who, after receiving sundry small slaps and pushes from the more energetic of the ladies, was mercifully sent home, the 9pence with which she was to have been rewarded being escheated to the Kenwigs family. "And whatever we are to say to you, sir," exclaimed Mrs. Kenwigs, addressing young Lillyvick's deliverer, "I'm sure I don't know."
"You need say nothing at all," replied Nicholas. "I have done nothing to found any very strong claim upon your eloquence, I am sure."
"He might have been burnt to death if it hadn't been for you, sir," simpered Miss Petowker.
"Not very likely, I think," replied Nicholas, "for there was abundance of assistance here which must have reached him before he had been in any danger." "You will let us drink your health anyway, sir," said Mr. Kenwigs, motioning towards the table. "In my absence, by all means," rejoined Nicholas with a smile. "I have had a very fatiguing journey and should be most indifferent company. A far greater check upon your merriment than a promoter of it, even if I kept awake, which I think very doubtful. If you will allow me, I'll return to my friend, Mr. Noggs, who went upstairs again when he found nothing serious had occurred. Good night." Excusing himself in these terms from joining in the festivities, Nicholas took a most winning farewell of Mrs. Kenwigs and the other ladies, and retired after making a very extraordinary impression upon the company.
"What a delightful young man!"
cried Mrs. Kenwigs. "Uncommon gentlemanly, really," said Mr. Kenwigs. "Don't you think so, Mr. Lillyvick?" "Yes," said the collector with a dubious shrug of his shoulders. "He is gentlemanly, very gentlemanly, in appearance."
"I hope you don't see anything against him, uncle?"
inquired Mrs. Kenwigs. "No, my dear," replied the collector. "No. I trust he may not turn out, well, no matter. My love to you, my dear, and long life to the baby."
"Your namesake,"
said Mrs. Kenwigs with a sweet smile. "And I hope a worthy namesake," observed Mr. Kenwigs, willing to propitiate the collector. "I hope a baby as will never disgrace his godfather, and as may be considered in arter years of a piece with the Lillyvicks whose name he bears. I do say, and Mrs. Kenwigs is of the same sentiment, and feels it as strong as I do, that I consider his being called Lillyvick one of the greatest blessings and honours of my existence."
"The greatest blessing, Kenwigs,"
murmured his lady. "The greatest blessing," said Mr. Kenwigs, correcting himself. "A blessing that I hope one of these days I may be able to deserve." This was a politic stroke of the Kenwigses, because it made Mr. Lillyvick the great head and fountain of the baby's importance. The good gentleman felt the delicacy and dexterity of the touch, and at once proposed the health of the gentleman, name unknown, who had signalized himself that night by his coolness and alacrity. "Who, I don't mind saying," observed Mr. Lillyvick, as a great concession, "is a good-looking young man enough, with manners that I hope his character may be equal to."
"He has a very nice face and style, really,"
said Mrs. Kenwigs. "He certainly has," added Miss Petowker. "There's something in his appearance quite dear, what's that word again?" "What word?" inquired Mr. Lillyvick. "Why, dear me, how stupid I am!" replied Miss Petowker, hesitating. What do you call it when lords break off door-knockers and beat policemen and play at coaches with other people's money and all that sort of thing?" "Aristocratic," suggested the collector. "Ah, aristocratic," replied Miss Petowker. "Something very aristocratic about him, isn't there?" The gentlemen held their peace and smiled at each other as who should say, "Well, there's no accounting for tastes." But the ladies resolved unanimously that Nicholas had an aristocratic air, and nobody caring to dispute the position, it was established triumphantly. The punch being by this time drunk out, and the little Kenwigses, who had for some time previously held their little eyes open with their little forefingers, becoming fractious and requesting rather urgently to be put to bed, the collector made a move by pulling out his watch and acquainting the company that it was nigh 2 o'clock, whereat some of the guests were surprised and others shocked, and hats and bonnets being groped for under the tables and in course of time found, their owners went away, after a vast deal of shaking of hands and many remarks how they had never spent such a delightful evening, and how they marvelled to find it so late, expecting to have heard that it was 10:30 at the very latest, and how they wished that Mr. and Mrs. Kenwigs had a wedding-day once a week, and how they wondered by what hidden agency Mrs. Kenwigs could possibly have managed so well, and a great deal more of the same kind. To all of which flattering expressions Mr. and Mrs. Kenwigs replied by thanking every lady and gentleman, seriatim, for the favour of their company, and hoping they might have enjoyed themselves only half as well as they said they had. As to Nicholas, quite unconscious of the impression he had produced, he had long since fallen asleep, leaving Mr. Newman Noggs and Smike to empty the spirit-bottle between them, and this office they performed with such extreme good-will that Newman was equally at a loss to determine whether he himself was quite sober, and whether he had ever seen any gentleman so heavily, drowsily, and completely intoxicated as his new acquaintance. Chapter 15